A sequel's job isn't easy. The first entry in a game or film series spends much of its runtime introducing the characters, the world, the story, and has no real stylistic expectations put upon it. The groundwork laid out in the first entry frees up a lot of time for the sequel, but that time is both a blessing and a curse. It's got more room to move, but it's still on the tracks laid by its predecessor. A sequel is expected to innovate and expand upon what came before, while not straying too far from what made it so great to begin with. By that metric, Donkey Kong Country 2 is the perfect sequel. Come on, you all knew this was coming. DKC2 is my favorite game, of course I'm gonna rave about it. But even putting my personal feelings aside, I feel like I'm pretty spot on here. Everything that made the first game great is intact. The gameplay is the same, with some improvements and additions to both the Kongs and Animal Buddies abilities, as well as the level designs. The theme and aesthetic are very much its own, while being totally cohesive with what we've seen before. Then there's the music, the single greatest video game soundtrack ever made. Donkey Kong Country set the bar impossibly high, and Donkey Kong Country 2 jumped right the fuck over it. This is part 1 of Overthinking Donkey Kong Country 2. I said in the first episode of Overthinking Donkey Kong Country that the first level of any video game has to say a lot in a short amount of time while also not saying too much, or something like that. Pirate Panic approaches its first level role a little differently than Jungle Hijinks, but it still understands the assignment. It makes the assumption that players are coming to it from DKC, and as such is largely a showcase for the new gameplay mechanics, while also keeping the difficulty low for those who might be going in blind. Something I found super interesting when replaying Pirate Panic for this series is how the first few beats of the level mirror the first few beats of Jungle Hijinks. Let's take a look at the two levels side by side. Right at the start, you've got DK's treehouse and K. Rool's cabin. That alone does a lot to set the tone for the second game. We're not in DK's home anymore. This is K. Rool's turf. This time around, he's got the home field advantage. But now look at how both levels unfold. A small line of bananas. 2 in DKC2 maybe being a reference to it being the second game, but I doubt it. The first enemy of both games comes next. Naughty in DKC and Neek in DKC2. Neek is clearly the replacement for Naughty in this game, and is a great enemy to start with. It's also a nice touch having the Gangplank Galleon infested with rats. Just shows how much the flagship of K. Rool's pirate army has deteriorated since the events of the first game. Moving on. Right after Naughty and Neek is the first DK barrel of the game. Following that, we've got another Naughty and Neek with the first Kremling enemy on the platform above. Critter in DKC and Clomp in DKC2. Clomp is this game's Critter. They're the same build and play the same role. There's a K above the Critter and a Banana Bunch above the Clomp, the K having switched sides in the second game. Next is where the games start to deviate. Both have two small platforms right next to each other, with either the Banana Bunch in DKC or the K in DKC2 between them. But the enemies are different. While the second game doesn't have the parallel treetop path, it does tip its hat to it in the form of a hidden barrel above K. Rool's cabin. But that's where the similarities end. From here, Pirate Panic starts to forge its own path, and the new additions to DKC2 take center stage. The first thing we see as the two games deviate is a giant A made of bananas. And for those who aren't already familiar with the new team-up mechanic, the first banana coin in the game. I mentioned the overhead path at the start of the level, but if for some reason new players haven't used the team-up ability yet, here's the level teaching them all about it. The coins are another new addition. The first game lets you use the services of Funky, Candy, and Cranky for free, but in DKC2, you'll need to pay. I don't really like this addition, but it's never an issue. You passively collect so many banana coins throughout the game that you'll never find yourself lacking. The first bonus barrel is shortly after. You'll find yourself at the first pit in the game. It's a narrow gap with a vertical line of bananas going down. This tiny section of the level is kind of beautiful from a game design perspective. Let me explain. Bananas are commonly used in basically every Donkey Kong game as communication. When in doubt, follow the bananas. Bananas going down the pit tell the player to go down the pit. Players can still miss that though, or maybe feel some trepidation towards blindly jumping down the hole, which is why the third new gameplay addition waits for the Kongs on the other side of the gap. Clobber, a Kremling that disguises itself as a barrel, attacks by running into the player. He doesn't do any damage, the Kongs simply bounce off him, but that's precisely why he's dangerous. He's often placed near pits and hazards to push the Kongs into them if they're not alert. He's a fantastic addition to the Kremlings, and one that is sure to keep the returning players on their toes. So what we've got here is a bunch of concepts taught to even the most unobservant of players in a zero consequence environment. The player can learn to traverse gaps without losing a life if they mess it up. They can follow the bananas to a secret area without having to risk anything. They're introduced to Clobber, as well as Clobber's attack strategy in an area that has no actual hazards. And finally, if the player chose to ignore the bananas in the pit, Clobber now forces them down, introducing them to the bonus barrel, as it's the only way out. Players returning from DKC might be aware of bonus areas, but not bonus barrels, and definitely not their newfound significance to the game. And new players might not know about bonus areas at all. I didn't do the best job of illustrating the genius design behind this small, unassuming chunk of level, but it really is brilliant. The first bonus level is great too. It's ridiculously simple, and so it should be. It's an introduction to the new Creme coins and clearly wants the player to succeed. Let's keep going. Just like in Jungle Hijinks, we run into Rambi the Rhino. And just like in Jungle Hijinks, the very next thing is a conga line of enemies to plow through. The difference here is preceding them is another A made of bananas. Yet another new mechanic in DKC2. If you hold down A with some animal buddies, you'll be able to charge up a special attack. With Rambi, holding and releasing A will have him stampede across the screen, only stopping when you move in the opposite direction or he hits a wall. Speaking of hitting a wall, right after finding Rambi, there's an arrow made of bananas pointing back in the direction you came. Charge at the wall with Rambi and you'll find the second bonus area of Pirate Panic. This one is themed Destroy Them All, fairly straightforward. After that is a very attainable DK coin, another new addition, plus the no animal sign and finally the end of level target. All are new to DKC2 and perfectly communicate their roles to the player simply by design alone. The point of Pirate Panic is the same as every good first level. Establish mood, set the tone, teach new players and reacquaint old players with the basics, as well as introducing the more prevalent changes and additions. Pirate Panic succeeds on every front here. As for what Pirate Panic tells us about the story, what story there is anyway, it's a little less clear. Starting Donkey Kong Country 2 in the exact spot DKC left off is a great tactic for orienting the player. Despite the time jump, it's a clear visual connective tissue between the two, and it makes sense from a narrative perspective. Donkey Kong has been kidnapped by K. Rool, so where better to start looking than his last known location? And as mentioned earlier, we can see a noticeable deterioration of the Gangplank Galleon, so we can deduce that the Kremling army is disorganized and equally worse for wear. When the Kongs found that the run-aground Gangplank Galleon was still crewed, they knew they were going in the right direction. And that about wraps up the very first episode of Overthinking Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. There's some stuff I didn't cover, like the warp barrel at the start, the cheat to get all 75 Creme coins in K. Rool's cabin, the fantastic sound design, like the way the waves lap against the hull and the boards of the deck creak beneath your feet, and how Rambi's introduction could be yet another parallel with Jungle Hijinks, but I couldn't figure out how to work it into the script. Something else I couldn't figure out how to work into the script was the overall theme of the game. This, like everything on my channel, is just speculation, but I feel that entropy is a huge theme in this game. As we'll explore throughout the series, the Kremling's home is in shambles, and largely by their own doing. It's something that's hinted at in the first game, as well as being the possible motivation for their actions in that game too. But now we finally see it in person. It's not hard to see why they did what they did as you move through the various locations of Crocodile Isle. Overall, I don't think Pirate Panic makes the impact that Jungle Hijinks does. It's a great level, but Jungle Hijinks is, in my humble opinion, one of the most creative and exciting opening levels of a video game. Expecting Pirate Panic to hit that bar might be asking a bit too much. DKC2 is my favorite game of all time. I've beaten it 3 times this year alone, and each and every time was an absolute joy. I've been looking forward to making this series since the first video I released on this channel. I had a blast making it, and I really hope you enjoy what's to come.